I was at work a few weeks ago, and it was one of those nights where I just knew that I was going to regret going in that day. I worked at the gas station in town, and while most nights were normal, every now and then we had some craziness happen. Nothing like that night though. It was probably 9:30, and because it's usually slow at that time, I figured I would check the bathrooms to make sure they were clean. And when I do that, because I'm usually working alone, I tend to lock the front door and close the gas station for a few minutes so that no one can take anything from the store while I'm not looking. This time though, I was hesitant to unlock the door, because when I came out of the bathroom, I was shocked to see a man standing on the outside of the window with his head pressed up against the glass. I just stood there for a moment, trying my best to get my composure before unlocking the door. But I told myself that it was probably just a customer, and I just happened to catch him looking in to see why the store was closed. I waved to the man and made my way over to the door with a smile on my face. I unlocked the door and held it open for the man as I apologized for closing it, but he didn't move toward me at all. His body had turned so that he could keep his eye on me, but when I invited him inside, he just stood there. I was confused for a minute, and I started to get an uneasy feeling that was making my throat dry up. I decided to just walk back inside the gas station and get behind the counter. I figured that when he was ready to come inside, he would. Still though, he didn't move. He just kept his face pressed up to the glass and his eyes fixed on me. There was even another customer that came into the store, and as they were waiting for me to check them out, they asked me what he was doing. I told them that I wasn't sure, but he had been there for about 20 minutes by that point. The customer told me that it was really creeping her out, so I told her that I could walk her out of the store and figured I would tell the guy to leave because he was scaring away business. She thanked me and I walked her to the door and made sure that she got over to her car safely before turning to the man who was still standing in the same spot as before and still staring at me. "Excuse me, sir," I said, trying to maintain a calm tone. The man began grumbling something to himself under his breath, but I couldn't quite understand it. "I'm gonna have to ask you to leave if you don't plan on buying anything. Customers have complained," I said with the same tone of voice as before. The man's eyes widened, and I could tell that he was clenching his jaw. I started to feel really tense, and it was taking everything in my body not to go back into the store and lock the door. Then, out of nowhere, it was like he got the message. Without saying or mumbling another word, he just turned and walked away. I went back into the gas station and continued working for the next few hours. I couldn't say I was comfortable though, because every now and then, I would look toward the parking lot and fear that I would see that man again. And about 30 minutes before closing time, my worst fear came true. I looked out toward the parking lot to see if there was anything I needed to do to the pumps before I started locking up, and that was when I saw him. The man was back, only this time, he didn't have his face pressed against the window. Instead, he was standing about a foot away from the door, and it looked like he had something in his hand. I knew that there was something wrong, but I didn't have any time to react. As soon as I noticed the man, he quickly rushed into the gas station and made his way over to the counter. I reached underneath the counter and grabbed the phone, hoping that I could dial 911 in time, but I wasn't quick enough. The man had made his way up to the counter with what I could now see was a small hammer in his hand. He swung the hammer across the counter at me, but I managed to step out of range. It was too bad for me that I couldn't move any further than that, because as soon as I took a step back, the man jumped over the counter, and as soon as he was on the same side as me, he started swinging the weapon relentlessly. I tried to cover my face, but my arms could only withstand a few hits before they couldn't take it anymore. I put them down and tried to ask the man why he was doing this, but I couldn't get the words out in time. He struck me, and I felt the side of my head get strangely warm. I quickly got lightheaded before I passed out. I don't know if he thought he had killed me, but he stopped there with his attack. Some time passed before I managed to wake up, but when I did, I saw that the store had been robbed and ransacked. I felt the side of my head and could tell that I was still bleeding, so I made sure to get up slowly as I called the police and an ambulance. I ended up spending a week in the hospital being treated and monitored for a minor skull fracture. The man that robbed me, though, was long gone, and as of right now, hasn't been caught. The police do think he was connected to 3 other robberies in the state, though, so they'll hopefully get him soon. My boss originally didn't want to have me working overnights at the gas station because I was his only female employee and he said it wasn't safe. But I told him that I could use the hours and he couldn't keep me from working the later shifts just because I was a woman. And as happy as I am that he eventually gave in, I sometimes wish that I kept my old hours. It was a little over a month after I started working the overnight shifts with my other coworker, Mateo. That night though, I was working by myself because Mateo wasn't feeling well. That was fine though. By then I knew what I was doing and I figured I could handle the gas station by myself for a few hours. I was quickly proven wrong though when my first customer that night was a young man who was clearly already drunk. He came in to buy beer, and I could tell by the way that he was talking that it wasn't his first case that night. I asked him for his ID, and when he surprisingly turned out to be over 21, I sold him the beer and hoped that he would just leave. He didn't go anywhere though. He just stayed at the counter trying to make small talk with me, even though there were a few people in line behind him. The man behind him ended up sort of pushing past him and placing his things on the counter, which I was happy about because it made the drunk guy have to step away and leave. I could tell by the look on his face he wasn't happy about it though. After I finished ringing everything else up, I got back to maintaining the store. A little while later, the same guy from before came in, only this time, he was even more intoxicated. I noticed him come into the gas station right away because when he swung the door open, he practically fell backward. And just like last time, he made his way over to the beer and then up to the counter. Only this time, I didn't have anyone else in the store with me. I asked him for his ID again because it's policy, and this time, he made a joke and said that if I wanted his name, all I had to do was ask. I tried to explain that it was just company policy that I check the ID of everyone who buys alcohol, but he just laughed through what I was saying. I was already pretty uncomfortable, but things got worse when I handed his ID back to him, and instead of just taking it, he grabbed my hand as well. I tried to pull it away, but he held onto it tight and then started to ask me what time I got off work. I couldn't take the discomfort anymore, and I ripped my hand away from him before sternly telling him the price of his beer. That was when his smile suddenly left his face. He told me that I was rude for speaking to him that way and then practically threw his money at me before walking away from the counter. As he was walking out of the door, I heard him mumbling under his breath something that I couldn't quite catch. The only words I understood were, "The next time I see her." I tried to relax as I finished up my shift, and I was relieved that the rest of my customers that night were much nicer and less intoxicated than that guy. And when it came time to close up, I couldn't wait to get home and just forget all the nonsense that happened. I wish I hadn't been in so much of a rush though. Then I might have noticed the car that was still sitting in the parking lot. I didn't see it until I was already out of the door and locking it though. I tried not to let it bother me as I noticed someone was sitting inside of it, and I just walked past and made my way over to my car, which was on the other side of the building. As I made my way around the corner of the building though, I heard the sound of footsteps slowly walking up from behind. I knew that it was whoever had been in that car, and even though I told myself that it was probably just a customer that was going to ask me to open back up for them, I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was going to happen. I reached into my purse and started shuffling around for my can of mace and started walking toward my car a bit faster. That was when I heard a familiar voice that made my fears all too real. It was the drunk guy from earlier. He told me to turn around, and despite my better judgment, I listened. But when I noticed he was reaching his hand out to grab me, I ripped my mace out of my bag and pepper sprayed him before running to my car. I managed to get inside and lock the door before he could get a hold of me, but he kept trying as he stumbled toward my car. He tried pulling on the door handle to open the door, but he was too hurt from the pepper spray to really try his hardest. That gave me just the time I needed to turn my car on and drive away as fast as I could. As I drove home, I called the police to report the man and told him where I had last seen him, and then I notified my boss as well. I'm glad I got away that night, and I'm horrified to think what would have happened to me if I hadn't. I mean, he must have been waiting outside of that store for me for hours. I never saw that man again, and I hope it stays that way. After about 3 years of working at the gas station, I ended up getting promoted to nighttime manager, which meant that I was in charge of the store from the hours of 6 p.m. until 6 a.m. And normally, that was no problem for me. But I'll never forget the incident that almost made me reconsider my position. It was one of those nights where I was running the store by myself, and we ended up getting slammed with customers. I don't know where everyone was going, but apparently everyone needed gas and snacks. It kept me really busy for a while though, and before I knew it, there was only about an hour left in my shift. As the business died down a bit, I started cleaning up the counter and getting things ready for closing when I heard a noise. I was really confused because it sounded like there was something moving around the back room, but I knew that there was nobody in there. I walked over to the door and continued to listen to see if I heard another noise or not. And that was when I heard another thump come from the other side of the door. I reached forward and turned the handle to enter the room, but when I poked my head in, I didn't see anything. I looked around to see if anything was out of place, but I couldn't tell if anything had been moved or not. I stood there for a minute wondering what that noise was, but eventually I just figured it was something settling in the desk or maybe even the air vent and decided to get back to work. I went back out and over to the register where I started moving the cash into the little money pouch that my boss insisted on using before putting the cash into the safe. But I didn't even get halfway through the register before I heard the same thumping noise that I did before. This time, I didn't wait to hear the noise twice. I shut the cash register and then rushed over to the back room and went right in. This time, I could tell that things had been moved around a bit. I could see some of the papers on the table had slid around, but I couldn't see anybody in the room. I started spinning in circles, wondering what I could have been hearing and why things were moved around, and that was when I noticed it. I took in a deep breath as my eyes locked onto one of the ceiling tiles that had been pushed up slightly. I didn't want to check it myself, but I knew that I couldn't just leave without figuring out what was going on in the store. So I slowly stood on the chair next to the desk and then with one hand, I pushed up the ceiling tile. I reached my hand up into the ceiling and let out a loud scream when I felt something grab onto my wrist. I fell backward off the chair, and as I looked up at the ceiling, I saw exactly what had touched me. I continued to scream in terror as I made eye contact with the man who had stashed himself up in the ceiling. I scrambled to get up as I noticed him starting to climb out of the ceiling, and I ran right out of the room before he could start to chase me down. After making it out of the room, I ran behind the counter and grabbed my cell phone to call the police as I made my way out of the store, locking the door behind me. I started shaking out of fear as I saw the man walking out of the back room. His eyes were fixated on me as he ran across the room and tried to bust through locked doors. He couldn't force them open though, and I stood back as I waited for the cops to arrive. They arrested him, and it turned out that he was actually the owner's cousin, and they assumed that he was planning on stealing the money from the safe before it could have been brought to the bank.